So here I am again. This is the third in this particular series of the stories, but the whole thing is changing as I do it because I'm having other ideas. First of all, I had mentioned three segments to this, and that they still remain. But I'm going to add a segment at the end where I share some analytical bits about patterns I think I've seen and things I've learned. None of that is already prepared, so that might be added later. But that's going to be the fourth segment. The topics I have there are cultural captivity and anxiety running the show, scapegoating, and unveiling the key influencer. And there will probably be more, and maybe not in that order. So this video is the start of telling the stories about the work and the role. And I think I'm going to break them into individual stories because a couple of them are pretty big stories or pretty important, where I'd actually like to have a video of just that one story. I'm going to start with a pattern. So a lot of STM work is about patterns, and it's been very interesting to sit back and think about patterns that are consistent between churches. One of them is that the churches where there's been a hard parting, there's a lot of pattern to the fact that the search process and calling process had some shortcomings when that pastor was called. Due diligence wasn't done, or there was anxiety to just find a warm body. So one of the churches I became STM in, I'm going to say three of my contracts were the outcome of a hard parting having happened. It wasn't always in Article 17. Some hard partings end in an early retirement, and or a sabbatical with no return date. You know, there are many ways that pastors want to avoid having Article 17 associated with their name, and that's unfortunate. And there is some conversation about let's make a new category. So the pattern of poor work being done in the search process. Basically, the one Article 17 situation, the search committee worked very old school. By old school, I mean they got out the paper yearbook. A couple of older men were the head of this operation, and the old school way of doing it, this was legitimately a way of doing it at one time. You go through the yearbook and you see if the person's been in their church for 3 years, and if they have been there for 3 years, you phone them and you say, would you be in a position where you might consider a call? That's it. And so the stories I heard was that they'd gone through the entire yearbook doing that, and nobody was interested. And yeah, I can't tell some parts of the story, but so they did it a second time. They made a second list and they did it a second time. And that time there were 3 people who didn't resist strenuously enough. By this time, I think they'd been in operation for 1.5 years, and they, yeah, there was pressure mounting to find someone. And as often happens, it was a church that used to have no trouble attracting what we would call big name pastors, and so this was creating some angst among them. Like, why is nobody coming? Why is nobody interested? So eventually, they ended up in a conversation with somebody who, in hindsight, we all found out needed to leave where he was. So a pastor who needs to move ends up connecting with a calling committee that needs to find a warm body to put in the pulpit. Creates a lot of work for STMs. That's a pattern. So I make it a part of my work as an STM in a congregation to train. We have a great booklet as a denomination, but to train the search committee, myself, in that kind of thoroughness, in communicating well. That's a big problem with search committees. They don't do that well. And so I look for patterns. And another pattern that I've run into is because several of the churches that I contracted with were what we would call declining churches, churches that were into the 40 to 50 years of existence. Um, the founding generation was dying off, and a lot of the kids had moved away, and so several of them have been like a small fraction of the number of attendees that used to be there. One of them used to have at least 2 services, if not 3, on a Sunday morning, and was now down to 1 service, and that was only half full, right? A major capacity situation. So that points to a second pattern that I hear in the stories often, is this waiting for the dead to resurrect and return, is what I call it, right? So I've had the experience of coming into the worship space, and I'm following an older lady who's obviously late, so she's trying to hurry, and she's kind of muttering about, I hope there's still a seat. And she's talking about a worship space that rarely was half full. So where does that concern come from? Well, there was a day when they built an overflow, and they would have to put out chairs, and so she was in that mode. So I was part of a cohort that came out of my second training, where you could volunteer to do kind of a group project or group projects together afterwards. And as part of that group project, I brought this issue forward, that grandparents were still hoping for their kids or grandkids to come back. They would not address the question of, why do you think they left? They just wanted them to come back. And it was obvious to me that wasn't going to happen. So we came up with, as a collective, as a group, the idea. Oh, the other challenge that was there was that how hard it was to rope off like the last 12 pews to get people sitting closer together, because the singing, they all agreed, the singing was vastly improved when everybody was together. A former choir director or somebody made us do that one time, made them do that. Everybody come to the end, to the aisle, let's all, or stand in the aisle, and let's sing a song together. And everybody was amazed at how good that felt and sounded. But the ropes never stayed. So the idea was, I call it draping for, oh dear, I forget what I call it. It was a draping. So on a New Year's Eve, in the New Year's Eve service, we did a service of lament for all those who had gone. This church had more than 20 fairly new widows, 2 widowers who were popular. So in that service, it was a theme of lament. The message was on lament, probably out of Joel. And then at a point in the service, somebody read off the names of all the people that had died or left in the last 10 years. And it was quite a list. And then as those names were read, I had a couple people drape off with black cloth the last 12 pews. What I was trying to do was symbolically represent that they were dead and buried. They were gone. People thought it really weird, some of the feedback. It seemed like a kind of a Catholic thing to do, I remember one guy saying. But whereas in the past they had moved the ropes to sit in those pews, nobody sat in those pews till we removed the black cloth on Easter Sunday. Speaking of the resurrection, we removed the cloth and put the ropes back up so they could sit there again. So now here's the interesting thing that happened. That same lady I spoke of having followed in, who was worried about finding a seat. My entire time there was a children's message each Sunday morning, and there were somewhere between 8 and 12 children every time. So the Sunday after the black cloth was either inserted or removed, I happened to be near the same lady as she was talking to a friend of hers, and she was saying, I never knew we had 12 kids in this church. Do you catch the juxtaposition between the first thing I heard her say and this thing she said to a friend? She wasn't able to see the kids until the people who were gone were buried, so to speak. So that's one story of one of the things that I did once in a church out of a pattern that I saw. But that pattern of waiting for the others to return is a common one, where they haven't let go of those who have actually left. And because they haven't let go, they can't really see who they have there. So why don't I tell another story now? In another church, they had a large number of refugees that they had assisted to come to Canada, and who stuck with the church. In the 80s, we did a lot of boat people, Vietnamese refugees, sponsored a lot of those as churches. But my understanding, my impression is that they somehow didn't stick to the church. But these particular refugees from Myanmar absolutely said, God brought us to this church. This is our church. But in a similar pattern of waiting for their kids and grandkids to return, over time I began to see that they were invisible to the core congregation. There were a couple people that were very intentionally engaged with the refugees, and but there was this sort of invisibility about them. So that became the obvious transitional phase. That church had a transition team, and they were the ones that came up with and owned that we need to transition. So at one point, so I just started bringing, I have what I call a Columbo technique. So I ask questions, but they do have a focus to them. And so I asked at one meeting, like, how many of our refugees have become members? Somebody looked it up, brought it back to the next meeting. I think it was 30%. 30% of the paper membership of the church was these refugees. That's no small number, right? And so to leverage that as an awareness thing, like, look at this. You've got, and then I did some things where I started leveraging the experience of having been immigrants that was still in the core of that congregation, people with Dutch accents, still there, and leveraging that to say, what the immigrant experience is like. What would have been nice for you, like when you first came to Canada and didn't speak a word of English, and you had to go to English church services? What would have been nice for you there? What would you have appreciated? Oh, the scripture being read in Dutch. The minister can preach all he wants in English, but just read the scripture in Dutch. That evolved into asking a person from the refugee group to read the scripture in their language, because some of them didn't speak English. Many of anyone over 50 did not speak English well, right? So that's another place where that pattern was in effect, and as an STM, finding ways of addressing that pattern and letting go of the people they're hoping to come back, and seeing who's actually there. In the one case, it was 12 kids. In the other case, it was almost a third of our membership is refugees, and they're determined to make a go of it here. Let's respect that. And so that church, the refugee one, adopted a process of deliberately becoming, they went from assimilation to integration. So where they were kind of, weren't aware of it, but they were really expecting the refugees to learn to become like them. Instead, started respecting the cultures of other peoples that were with them. There were a few families from Africa as well. And honoring those cultures by, for instance, having the scripture read in another language. And they did a few other things, but those are details. So now they were integrating other cultural Christianities into their worship. That became their goal, and that felt like a success for me as a transitional minister, that they could get to that point of seeing that. I'll stop there with this one, and then I'll do the next. The next two will be independent stories under this theme of looking at the work and the role and experiences I've had in it.